Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the fourth lesson in our course Experimental Psychology. In the previous lesson, we have talked about non-experimental research design. In this lesson, we are going to talk about experiments. We're going to try to define experiments, look at what advantages we have in experiments, and look at the variables, both intentional and extraneous variables in experiments. Now, um, in the instructions for this lesson, I have said that you should first watch this video, the video made by Human Meter on regarding do Filipinos with the title "Do Filipinos Help Someone Based on Looks?" Now they said it's a social experiment, but the point our point today is to well try to decide kung experiment nga ba ito or hindi. Now, sabi natin, isa sa pinaka-importanting values na matututunan natin or natututunan natin in science is to delay our conclusion. So at this point, I don't want you to answer this question just yet. I want you to delay answering this question up until the end of this video, up until the end of this lesson. Okay, so may ano 'no, meron kasing if kung madalas ka sa social media or sa YouTube makakakita ka ng napakaraming social experiments. And it's as if social experiment belongs to a continuum na kasama yung prank, yung practical joke, tsaka yung social experiment. But the thing is, experiments are not like that. Okay, experiments, whether they are natural experiments or field experiments or laboratory experiments, all necessitate the use of scientific method. Hindi pa pwedeng gagawa ka lang ng kalokohan tapos sabihin mong social experiment yung ginagawa mo. Hindi pa pwedeng halimbawa, magpa-prank ka lang sa tingin mo ay taong gold digger tapos sasabihin mong social experiment or halimbawa tatambay ka lang sa labas, titignan mo gaano karami ang catcall sa'yo. Hindi pwedeng social experiment agad yon. Okay? An experiment regardless of its nature, kung siya ay natural, field, or laboratory experiment, kailangan lahat yan ay sumusunod sa scientific method. Hindi pwedeng titignan lang natin kung anong mangyayari. Hindi experiment yon. Okay, so paano nga ba natin masasabi na may nagaganap na experiment? Number one, ang experiment ay nangyayari when the environment is systematically manipulated so that the causal effect of this manipulation on some behaviors can be observed. Okay, merong keyword dyan, systematically manipulated. Hindi po pwedeng susubukan lang natin kung anong mangyayari. Experiments do not happen like that. Experiments tend to support or experiments are conducted uh, to test a particular hypothesis. Hindi po pwedeng susubukan lang natin kung anong mangyayari. Kailangan may klarong hypothesis na agad. So, importante rin na yung aspects of the environment that are not of interest and hence are not manipulated are held constant so that not to influence the outcome of the experiment. Isa to sa pinaka-importante pero often nami-miss out na characteristic ng isang experiment. Kailangan meron ka ring control over other variables. Okay, dalawang variable lang kadalasan ang pinag-aaralan sa experiment. At yung mga bagay na nasa labas ng variables na to ay kadalasan kinokontrol or yung sinasabi nating held constant. So that you would know that yung changes sa isang variable was caused by the other variable and not by some variable in nature. Okay, pag-uusapan ba natin yan na mas maayos later on? But at this point, I want to define what an experiment is. An experiment is the systematic manipulation of some factors in the environment to observe the effects of this manipulation on behavior. Ito yung definition natin gagamitin sa experiment sa buong course natin sa experimental psychology. So, hindi kasamang experiment yung subukan lang natin kung ano mangyayari. Okay, ulitin ko. Ang isang experiment should be done in the context of the scientific method, meaning bago mo gawin yung experiment na yun, dapat meron kang clearly stated na hypothesis. Hindi lang yung, let's just see what happens. Okay? Hindi pa pwedeng mangyari yun. Now, tignan natin ang uh, kung ano ang advantages ng isang experiment. Okay, number one, it has better control of extraneous variables. Meaning, kung babalikan natin yung lesson natin sa non-experimental research design, walang method or walang design doon na may control on extraneous variables. Remember, yung correlational design, like gamitin natin ulit yung example ng ice cream tsaka uh, violent crimes in the US, walang control of the extraneous variable. Yung extraneous variable doon yung weather, okay? In correlation, you report the correlation as it is. You report the relationship between two variables as it is without controlling extraneous variables. Now, in experiments, napaka-importante or bahagi actually ng pag-design ng maayos na experiment ang pag-control ng extraneous variable. So with that, pwede mong sabihin na isolated yung relationship between two variables and as much as possible na control mo yung extraneous variable. Second, it permits statements of causation. Sa correlation, ulitin natin, correlation is not causation. Only through experiments can you make statements of causation. Pag sinabi natin causation, it's the assumption that one variable leads to the change of another variable. So one is a cause and one is an effect. So in non-experimental researches, hindi po pwede yun. Hindi mo pa pwedeng tignan yung epekto ng isang bagay sa isa pang bagay without using the experimental method. Pangatlo, it's usually quick, efficient in data gathering. Kasi kadalasan one shot lang ang experiment. Well, regardless, sometimes may design na repeated, pero in many cases, one shot lang yung experiment. As compared to other research methods, since gagawin ka ang research or rather ang experiment ay ginagawa kadalasan sa loob ng laboratory or in a controlled environment, mas efficient ito at mas mabilis ito mag-gather ng data. Now, tignan natin kung ano yung mga variables involved in an experiment. So, meron tayong dalawang forms ng variables. We have, on one side, meron tayong tinatawag nating intentional variables. And on the other side, meron tayong extraneous variables. Pag sinabi mong intentional variables, these are the variables that you intended to study in your experiment. Okay, meron dalawang forms ang intentional variables, and these are the gears and the cogs that run your experiment. Okay, meron tayong, halimbawa, ito yung example natin. You want to, halimbawa, ang hypothesis mo ay, does coffee change one's mood? Halimbawa, gusto mo matuklasan kung yung pag-inom ng kape ng isang tao ay nakaka-apekto sa mood niya. Okay? Ang assumption mo is that yung caffeine doon sa kape ay nakaka-apekto doon sa mood ng isang tao. So, ang isang independent variable or yung tinatawag nating IV is the variable that is manipulated by the experimenter to test the effects on the dependent variable. Okay? So, ito yung manipulation na sinasabi natin. Dito pumapasok yung kaninang sa definition natin ng experiment na something is being manipulated. In this regard, yung independent variable ang minamanipulate. So, sa example natin tungkol sa kape at sa mood, yung independent variable mo ay yung whether or not merong caffeine doon sa iyong kape na ibibigay sa iyong participant. Okay. Yung dependent variable doon sa example na yon ay yung mood. Okay, pag sinabi mong dependent variable, ito yung variable na sinusukat at nire-record mo. Ulitin natin yung independent variable, ito yung minamanipulate mo, yung dependent variable, ito yung sinusukat at nire-record mo. Ang isang experimenter ay hindi nagsusukat ng independent variable. Okay, tinitignan ng isang experimenter yung epekto ng independent variable sa dependent variable. So, in short, or in other words, ang sinusukat ng isang experimenter ay yung dependent variable. So, makikita mo rin, ano, no, may clue na kung ano ang dependent at independent variable. Doon pa lang sa pangalan, yung DV or independent variable ay dependent sa independent variable. Okay? Medyo mouthful pakinggan, ano? Or medyo confusing pakinggan. Let's use variable 1, variable 2. Say yung variable 2 yung dependent variable. Yung variable 2 ay dependent sa variable 1. Okay? Yung variable 1 ay independent of variable 2. Nagets ba natin yung ibig sabihin? So in this example ng coffee at saka mood, independent yung coffee doon sa mood. But yung mood, pero yung mood ay dependent doon sa coffee. So ang assumption natin is that mood will change in relation to changes that are being manipulated or in relation to changes that are being done by the experimenter dun sa level or dun sa presence or absence ng caffeine doon sa coffee. Okay, here are some more examples. Halimbawa, meron kang independent variable like a particular type of treatment, yung different type, halimbawa meron kang different types of therapy, and ang dependent variable mo ay isang behavioral variable katulad ng smoking behavior, eating behavior, and say activity level. Pwede rin naman na meron kang treatment factors katulad ng differences in time spent, sleeping the night before. Halimbawa, 8 hours, 6 hours, 4 hours, o pwede kang maglagay ng no sleep at all. At titignan mo yung physiological variables or yung epekto nito sa certain physiological variables katulad ng heart rate, blood pressure, brainwave activity. Okay, so pangatlo, merong mga environmental manipulations na pwedeng gawin. Halimbawa, yung type ng beverage na i-consume ng isang tao, whether or not caffeinated or decaf yung coffee na iinumin niya. And ang pwedeng, or isa sa mga pwedeng gawing variable ay, syempre, self-report variables katulad ng measures of anxiety, mood, or self-esteem. Now, if you are watching closely, makikita mo, ito din yung mga type ng independent at saka dependent variable na pwede mong gamitin in an experiment. Halimbawa, pwede mong baguhin or pwede mong i-testing type ng treatments, iba-ibang klaseng therapy, katulad sa example number 1. Pwede rin independent variable, yung may babaguhin, same treatments, may babaguhin ka lang sa level. So, halimbawa, sleep ang gusto mong pag-aralan, pare-pareho silang matutulog, iba-iba lang yung hours of sleep that they will get for the night before. Or pwede rin merong certain manipulation dun sa environment. Halimbawa, isang group ay tatanggap ng caffeinated coffee at isang group ay tatanggap ng decaf coffee. So, ito yung mga independent variables na pwede mong gawin. Okay? Type ng treatment, treatment factors, and experimental manipulation. On the other hand, ito rin naman yung pwede mong dependent variables na gamitin. Behavioral variables, pagbabago sa ugali ng isang tao. Halimbawa, nagbago yung smoking behavior, mas madalas siya mag-sigarilyo ngayon, mas madalas magsigarilyo or mas madalas siya kumain or mas mataas yung activity level. Tandaan natin, meron tayong mga parameters sa pagsusukat ng variables or sa pagsusukat ng behaviors. Nandun yung magnitude, gaano kagrabe yung behavior, nandun yung frequency, gaano kadalas nangyayari yung behavior, nandun yung duration, gaano kahaba nangyayari yung behavior, at latency, gaano kahaba yung espasyo between behavior 1 at behavior 2. Meaning, in between both smoking behaviors, gaano katagal yung oras na nangyayari. Okay, meron din tayong physiological variables. These are usually ginagamitan ng measures ng, syempre, physiological changes katulad ng heart rate, blood pressure, brainwave activity. Pwede rin halimbawa dyan ay ano pa bang physiological variables na pwede? Heart rate, blood pressure, halimbawa blood sugar, or yung oxygen level sa dun sa blood ng isang tao. So while uh, while itong first two variables are usually the first two options na meron tayo in experiments. Minsan, gumagamit din tayo ng self-report, pero to a limited degree only. Bakit? Kasi ang assumption natin is that uh, uh, self-reports are usually unreliable pagdating sa experiments kasi we want to see for ourselves yung changes na nangyayari doon sa tao, doon sa behavior or sa physiological capacity ng tao. Ayaw natin na basta tanungin lang yung isang tao. Pero in some cases where wala kang ibang choice pero tanungin yung isang tao, self-report variables are also welcome in experiments pero to a limited degree. Kadalasan, yung self-report ay sinasamahan ng behavioral or physiological variables. So ano itong mga self-report measures ng anxiety, mood, or self-esteem ay pwedeng variables na gamitin in experiments. So, uh, kung naguguluhan ka pa rin, yung independent variable ay yung presumed cause natin. Bakit presumed? Kasi again, science tayo, we don't jump into conclusions. We hypothesize na ito yung cause. And independent variable ay yung hypothesized effect. So kung medyo magulo pa rin, okay, ganito yan. Yung independent variable, ito yung minamanipulate mo. Independent variable, ito yung sinusukat mo. Okay? Hindi ka nagsusukat bilang experimenter, hindi ka nagsusukat ng independent variable. At hindi ka nagmamanipulate ng dependent variable, you measure your dependent variable. Okay? So, ito yung dalawang forms ng intentional variables. Ulitin ko, pag sinabi nating intentional variables, these are variables you intended to study in your research. Okay? You intended to look at in your investigations. Pero minsan, or hindi nga minsan, madalas, merong ibang variables na present sa experiment ng isang tao or sa experiment na ginagawa mo. Ito yung tinatawag nating extraneous variables. And these are all the other variables which are not your independent variable but who could affect yung result ng iyong experiment. So ito yung mga bagay na nasa paligid ng independent at dependent variable na pwede makaapekto sa resulta ng research mo. Okay, these are undesirable variables because they add error to your research and they threaten internal validity of your results. So, kung hindi ka nag-control ng extraneous variable, kadalasan ang question dyan ay, totoo nga ba na yung independent variable ang nag-cause ng changes sa dependent variable and not other extraneous variables involved? Okay, so a major goal in design experiments is to decrease or control the influences of the extraneous variable or of extraneous variables. Pwedeng marami kasi yan sa isang experiment. Now, sometimes it's not only impractical but impossible to eliminate extraneous variables. So what you do is you control them. What you do is to decrease its influence on your experiment, on your results. Okay, so ano yung mga types? Meron tayong situational variables, participant variables, experimenter effects, at saka meron tayong demand characteristics. Isa-isahin natin yan today. Okay, pag sinabi mong situational variables, these are aspects of the environment that might affect the participant's behavior. For example, noise or temperature dun sa room, yung lighting conditions or situational variable or dun sa experiment natin sa kape halimbawa, yung amount or pwedeng situational variable doon yung amount of coffee that the person is going to consume. Halimbawa, hindi mo nasukat ng maayos kung precisely 1 cup yung i-consume ng isang tao or 1 cup and a half yung binigay mo dun sa isang tao. That's a situational variable. Pag sinabi mo situational variables, these are things in the environment, okay, na pwedeng bumago doon sa relationship or pwede maka-apekto doon sa relationship ng independent at dependent variables. We should always control situational variables. So we make sure that they are the same for all participants. Halimbawa doon sa experiment natin on coffee and mood, you have to make sure that you are giving precisely 1 cup to each participant, nothing more, nothing less. Okay? if you have to, kailangan mo rin control yung temperature ng coffee na binibigay mo. Dapat pare-pareho in all participants. Walang mas malamig, walang mas mainit, walang cold brew, walang ibang form ng coffee. Kailangan uh, pagka pagka kailangan i-control mo yung situational variables so that you can really say that the changes in your dependent variable was brought about by the changes in your or by the manipulation you did on your independent variable. So, kadalasan sinusolusyonan natin itong situational variables by standardizing your procedures. Okay? This is to make sure that conditions are the same for all participants. This might also mean that you will have to standardize your instructions. So kadalasan meron diyang or in experiments, meron tayong script na ginagamit so that we can make sure na pare-pareho yung instruction na ibibigay mo sa lahat ng participants. So kasi minsan, pagka nagbibigay ng instruction, minsan nagbabago-bago dahil magpagod na yung experimenter o gusto niyang bilisan yung pag-conduct ng experiment. So, having a script can eliminate some forms of situation and variables in an experiment. Number two, meron tayong participant variables. These are, or this refers to the way in which each participant varies from each other. So this which could affect yung result noong experiment. This could include, halimbawa, yung baseline mood or yung intelligence, kung ang dependent variable mo ay, let's say, IQ, or kung ang dependent variable mo ay anxiety, yung baseline anxiety levels, yung nerves, yung concentration, all this can affect yung result mo. Okay? If you're not very careful in assigning to which group a person will be assigned to, minsan itong participant variables can affect your results. Okay, so paano to sinusolusyonan? We can counter the effect of participant variable by randomly allocating participants to particular conditions of the independent variable. So, ang importante sa experiments ay hindi random recruitment but rather random assignment ng mga tao or ng mga participants sa bawat grupo. So we have to make sure that when we say randomization of random assignment but rather random assignment is that dapat merong equal chances ang bawat participant na mapabilang sa control or sa experimental group. Okay? So, yung pangatlong type ng variable ay tinatawag nating experimental effect. Minsan wala doon sa situation yung extraneous variable, wala doon sa participant, but rather minsan nandun sa mismo experimenter. Okay, these are characteristics of the experimenter such as gender, racial bias, and even expectations that may influence how participants may behave in a given experiment. Sometimes, an experimenter might give unconscious clues dun sa alam niyang experimental group, okay, which could affect kung paano magbe-behave yung mga participants in a given setting. So minsan unconscious siyang may bias doon sa resulta. Gusto niyang palabasin na may epekto yung independent doon sa dependent variable. So, ang nangyayari ay pwede siyang magbigay ng cues, ng hints, ng instructions na special doon sa experimental group or kaiba doon sa control group. So, this is a potentially harmful extraneous variable kasi invisible siya. Kung hindi masyadong mindful yung experimenter, hindi niya mapapansin na meron siyang sariling biases. Okay, so paano nasosolusyonan to? Meron tayong tinatawag na double-blind experiments kung saan yung experimenter mismo ay hindi niya alam kung saang grupo mapapabilang ang kanyang participants. Halimbawa, doon sa example natin on coffee and mood, hindi niya alam kung yung participant ay umiinom ng decaf or ng caffeinated coffee. Halimbawa, naglagay ka sa ilalim ng iyong cup ng marker na ito ay halimbawa happy check pagka caffeinated, cross pagka decaf. At malalaman lang at the end of the experiment kung sino nag-consume ng decaf at saka sino nag-consume ng caffeinated pag tinignan yung ilalim ng baso. Okay, so anong tawag natin doon? Double-blind experiments. Bakit double-blind? Kasi both the experimenter and the participant are blind kung saan mapupuntang treatment group yung participant. Double yung blind na tao, yung participant tsaka yung experimenter. Lastly, meron tayong tinatawag na demand characteristics. And this refers to experimental artifacts where the participant may form interpretations of the experiment's purpose and subconsciously change the behavior to fit that interpretation. Minsan, yung participant ay meron sariling expectation. Kanina dun sa experimenter effects, yung expectation ng experimenter ang involved. Dito yung expectation naman ng isang participant. Halimbawa, gusto niya mag-serve as a good participant. So susubukan niyang mag-i-obey lahat ng instruction or halimbawa meron siyang interpretation na ako yung magiging rebel na participant. So ang gagawin niya ay susuwayin niya yung experimenter, susubukan niya ang lahat para ma-disrupt yung experiment. So in that tawag natin doon demand characteristic. Okay? Pwede rin halimbawa gusto niya magpakita ng socially desirable traits. So sa pagsasagot ng kanyang test, sa self-report test ay socially desirable yung answers. Yung self-report test ay yung last option natin pagdating sa dependent variable kasi madali siyang i-manipulate ng participants. Okay, now, ano yung pwedeng gamitin? Deception, unobtrusive measures, and certain unobtrusive manipulation are some of the means in which we can deal with demand characteristics. Pero we have to be guided that when you use deception, kailangan ito yung last resort at kailangan you have to inform your participant that you made use of a deception, especially when you are debriefing them. Okay? So, minsan, ito extraneous variables ay nagiging confounding variables. Minsan nuisance lang sila, pero minsan, or rather, pag hindi mo sila kinontrol, nagiging threat sila sa validity ng iyong research. When an extraneous variable changes systematically along with the variables that you are studying, this is now called confounding variable. Kumbaga, nagsaserve na unintended independent variable na yung extraneous variable so that you won't be so sure as to whether yung changes sa dependent variable ay dahil sa independent variable or dahil sa ibang extraneous variable. Halimbawa, sa experiment natin on coffee and in mood. Halimbawa ay hindi mo nasabihan yung mga participant mo beforehand na wag silang uminom ng kape bago yung experiment. Let's say some of the participants whom you assigned papunta sa decaf coffee ay uminom ng kape before the actual experiment, yun ay tinatawag nating confounding variable. Kasi yung pag-inom nila ng kape before the experiment can affect the way they perform or they behave in the experiment. Can affect their dependent variable systematically. Okay? So, a variable is considered to be confounding because it provides an alternative explanation for your result. Ibig sabihin, doon sa experiment natin, posibleng merong pagbabago or walang, halimbawa, nakita mo na walang pagbabago pala yung mood ng mga taong uminom ng coffee na decaf at mga taong uminom ng caffeinated coffee. Now, confounding variable or rather a variable is considered confounding kung magpo-provide siya ng alternative explanation. In our case, yung pag-inom ng kape before the experiment is a confounding variable because it provides an alternative explanation na wala difference in the mood of those who drank coffee that is caffeinated and those who drank coffee that is decaf kasi meron dun sa mga inassign mo sa decaf group ang uminom ng coffee beforehand. So, So, an alternative explanation for the relationship or difference between the variable and or group that you are measuring, ito yung sinasabi nating confounding variable. Okay? So, paano nga ba nagiging confounding ang extraneous variable? Meron dalawang bagay kang kailangan tingnan. Number one, kung nagka-create ba ito ng pangatlo, ng three or more variables involved. Okay? Dalawa lang dapat yung tinitingnan nating variable lagi. Yung independent, saka yung dependent variable. In the cases where there are extraneous variables that are confounding the research, merong pangatlo. Okay? Doon sa halimbawa, doon sa example natin last week sa correlation yung ice cream sales at saka yung violent crimes ay yung relationship ng ice cream sales at saka ng violent crimes ay confounded ng um, ng weather. Okay? So, pag sinabi mong confounding variable, ito ay posibleng nagpo-provide ng alternative explanation. So, ang alternative explanation dun sa relationship ng ice cream sales at saka ng violent crimes is that yung weather influences yung ice cream sales in the same manner the weather influences yung violent crimes committed in the US. Okay. Pangalawa, kailangan yung suspected third variable ay nagbabago systematically with at least one of the other variables. Kadalasan ito yung independent variable. Okay? Nagbabago or may variations or nagaganap doon sa extraneous variable, kasamang nagbabago nito yung independent variable in a very systematic manner. Okay? Halimbawa, doon sa example natin sa coffee, yung independent variable natin ay presence or absence ng caffeine sa kape. Confounding yung pag-inom ng kape ng mga participants na ma-assign sa control group. Kasi hindi mo ma-observe yung actual relationship between the independent at dependent variable. Okay? Let me just summarize the lesson. First, pinag-aralan natin ang definition ng experiment at sabi natin, an experiment is a systematic manipulation of some factors meaning the independent variable, to observe the effect of this manipulation on behavior or yung dependent variable. Sinabi natin, experiments permit yung causal statement of causation. Ibig sabihin, pwede kang mag-assume that one is the effect and one is the cause. And with regards to your variables, your independent variable should be manipulated, your dependent variable should be measured, and your extraneous variable should be controlled in order for them not to be confounding variables. So this ends our lesson on experiments, definition, advantages, and variables. In your next lesson, we are going to talk about types of experiments, types of experimental design, types of grouping in your experiment. So thank you for listening and have a great day.